Hello everyone, welcome back to Leagles Educare. Today we'll discuss an important yet controversial issue, rape on the false pretext of marriage, that is FPM. This topic touches on issues of consent, deception and societal norms. We'll simplify the legal principles, review landmark cases and explore recent reforms in the law. Let's begin. In India, false promises of marriage leading to sexual relationships can be treated as rape under Section 375 IPC. The court used Section 90 of IPC, which states that consent obtained under a misconception of fact is not valid. The idea is that if a woman consents to intercourse because of a false promise of marriage, it is not an informed consent. But this interpretation has led to debates as it blurs the line between the emotional deception and criminal intent. Now, let's talk about how the courts approach FPM cases. In FPM cases, courts examine number one, whether the woman consented based solely on a promise of marriage. Second, whether the promise was false from the beginning or later became unfulfilled due to genuine reasons. Now let's review important judgments in chronological order to understand the evolution of this legal principle. Case number 1 is Uday versus State of Karnataka 2003. This is one of the earliest Supreme Court case addressing FPM. Here is what happened. A woman claimed that she consented to sexual intercourse because of the accused's promise to marry her. However, when the marriage did not materialize, the court ruled in favor of the accused. The Supreme Court clarified consent obtained due to a genuine promise that could not be fulfilled later does not amount to rape. Only a false promise made with a bad intent invalidates consent under Section 90 of IPC. The court emphasized that emotional relationships and unforeseen circumstances must be evaluated individually before criminalizing such acts. Next case is Dilip Singh versus State of Bihar 2005. This case further elaborated on the interpretation of a misconception of fact. The accused had sexual relationships with the victim, promising to marry her. Later, the promise was not fulfilled. The Supreme Court laid down a test. Number one, was the woman's consent influenced by a false promise? Second, did the accused know or have reason to believe that his promise was false at the time it was made? The court highlighted that proving the accused's intent at the time of the promise is crucial for conviction. If the promise was genuine but unfulfilled due to changing circumstances, it does not amount to rape. Next case is Yedla Srinivas Rao versus State of Andhra Pradesh 2006 Supreme Court. This case highlighted a situation where the initial act was non-consensual. The accused forcibly had intercourse with the woman and only promised to marry her after she became pregnant. The Supreme Court held the promise to marry in such cases is an attempt to pacify the victim and does not retroactively legitimize a lack of consent during the initial act. The accused was convicted of rape, emphasizing the distinction between deception and coercion. Next case is Deepak Gulati versus State of Haryana 2013 Supreme Court. In this case, the Supreme Court provided a detailed analysis of false promise versus genuine promises. The accused and the victim were in a relationship and she alleged that she consented to sexual relations based on his promise to marry her. Later, he backed out. The court held a genuine promise later unfulfilled due to legitimate reasons does not amount to rape. However, if the accused had no intention of marrying the victim from the start, it constitutes a false promise and could be treated as rape. This case reinforced the importance of examining the accused's intent and the context of the relationship. Next case is Pramod Suryabhan Pawar versus State of Maharashtra 2019 Supreme Court. This case summarized the evolution of law regarding FPM. The accused had a long-term relationship with the victim and later married another woman. The victim alleged that she consented to the relationship based on his promise of marriage. The Supreme Court clarified the promise must be false and made with bad intent to invalidate consent. The false promise must directly cause the consent. In this case, the court found no evidence of bad intent and acquitted the accused, reaffirming that not all failed relationships lead to criminal liability. Next case is Anurag Soni versus State of Chhattisgarh 2019 Supreme Court. In this case, the accused had sexual relations with the victim after promising to marry her but later married someone else. The Supreme Court held that accused false promise invalidated the victim's consent under Section 90 of IPC. The court said a false promise made with malicious intent is considered fraud, making the consent invalid and amounting to rape. Next case is Niyam Ahmed versus State and City of Delhi 2023. In this case, the complainant, a married woman, alleged that she engaged in a relationship with the accused based on his promise to marry her, which he later did not fulfill. The courts analyzed the complexities of relations involving married individuals in this case. It stated that a breach of promise due to unforeseen circumstances should not be be equated with a false promise. In this case, the accused was acquitted as the court found no evidence of malicious intent at the time the promise was made. Next case is Mahesh Damu Khare versus State of Maharashtra 2024 Supreme Court. In this case, the Supreme Court highlighted a worrying trend of criminalizing consensual relations that turns sour, cautioning against automatically converting a relationship breakdown into a rape case. The court consistently maintained that to prove a false promise, there must be adequate evidence demonstrating that from the initial stage the accused had no genuine intention of marrying the woman. The Supreme Court clarified the distinction between a false promise to marry and a breach of promise in cases of alleged rape. For a promise to be false and constitute rape, it must have been made with malicious intent and no intention of fulfillment at the time. The promise must also be directly linked to the woman's decision to engage in sexual relations. The court stressed that consent must be active and reasoned, not caused or passive. It highlighted that simply breaking a promise due to unforeseen circumstances does not amount to rape. It highlighted the importance of active and reasoned deliberation in determining consent. The court held that a false promise made with malicious intent vitiates consent and amounts to rape. However, a genuine breach of promise does not. Let's simplify with examples. Case number 1. X promises to marry Y, but due to unforeseen reasons like career or family issues breaks the promise. In this case, it is not a rape. Another example. X pressures Y for sexual relations and falsely promises marriage with no intention to marry. This is a rape and falls under section 375. Now let's talk about the recent legal reforms, Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023. The Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023 replaced the IPC and introduced significant changes in criminal law. One of the key provisions, section 69, defines false promise of marriage, that is FPM, as a distinct sexual offense separate from rape. Let's talk about key features of section 69. Number 1, distinct offense. FPM is categorized separately, creating a clear distinction between deceptive promises and forceful acts. Next is focus on malicious intent. Only promises made with malicious intent are considered offenses. Genuine promises that fail due to unforeseen circumstances are not criminalized. Next is fair labeling. The law aims to address emotional deception by categorizing it as a fraud without distorting the traditional definition of rape. Next is protection of consent. The primary goal of this law is protect sexual autonomy and consent, making consent obtained through deception invalid. Now let's talk about the impact of section 69. Number 1, legal clarity. Defining FPM as a separate offense allows court to evaluate cases more clearly and make informed decisions. Next is balanced approach. The law strikes a balance between genuine promises and malicious deception, preventing emotional relations from being unfairly criminalized. Next is social awareness. This reform reflects the changing social norms around relationships and the importance of protecting sexual autonomy. Now let's talk about the critique of section 69. Number 1, over-criminalization. Critics argue that the law may unnecessarily bring premarital relationships and emotional dynamics under legal scrutiny. Next is gender bias. The law is primarily women-centric and does not address similar issues faced by men or LGBTQIA+ individuals. Section 69 is a progressive step that simplifies the legal dynamics of deception and consent. However, broader societal and philosophical question remains, such as number 1, should deceptive promises always be criminalized? Next is criminal law the best solution for addressing emotional deception? Now let's talk about the challenges and broader critique. Critique of FPM laws highlight number 1, fair labeling. Calling deception rape confuses fraud with force. Next is patriarchal norms. These laws reinforce old ideas about women's sexual autonomy. Next is social realities. Courts sometimes stigmatize premarital relationships, ignoring evolving social norms. Additionally, the law does not address similar challenges faced by men or LGBTQIA+ individuals in such scenarios. Now let's talk about the debate, should deceptive sex be criminalized? Let's examine both sides. For criminalization, number 1, deceptive promises exploit vulnerabilities, particularly in conservative societies. Such actions undermine sexual autonomy, similar to coercion. Against criminalization, criminalizing deception stigmatizes premarital sex and reinforces patriarchal norms. It risks making consensual relationships overly dependent dependent on legal scrutiny. So with this, let's conclude this video. The law on false promises of marriage has evolved significantly, especially with the introduction of Section 69 under BNS. However, deeper societal questions remain. Should promises of marriage influence sexual consent in the eyes of the law? Is criminal law the right tool to address emotional deception? Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Leagles Educare. Let's spread legal awareness together.